Alright guys, welcome back to my channel. It is fall, and that means gravel season is in full swing. So today, I'm super excited to share with you the 2021 Kona Libre Aluminum. As usual, we're going to look at the specs/features, we're going to find out the weight, we're going to check out the ride quality, and lastly, we're going to answer the question, should you buy this bike? So if you're interested, drop a like, hit subscribe, and let's hop right into it. Alright guys, well the Kona Libre originally debuted back in 2019, and at its launch, it was initially offered strictly in a carbon fiber version. And it was a really great bike, but because it was carbon fiber, the price was pretty high. And so by popular demand, Kona finally introduced an aluminum version of this bike in 2021, and that made this bike a lot more accessible to way more people. So let's talk about where this bike sits in Kona's lineup. So the Libre is marketed as a off-road adventure bike, great for bike packing and gravel rides and all around super long days in the saddle. It does work perfectly fine as a road bike as well, although it's not going to be as fast as a more traditional lightweight carbon fiber road bike. This also wouldn't be the best option for gravel racing. So if you were going to do gravel racing, you'd probably want to go with something like a Cervelo Aspero or a BMC Caius, but this bike is definitely suited for long, comfortable days in the saddle and is just at home on-road as it is off-road. Okay, so looking at the specs and features, let's start with the frame. So the frame is going to be a aluminum frame, although the fork is actually going to be a carbon fiber fork. This is Kona's Verso carbon fork, and it's the same fork that Kona offers in their highest end carbon fiber version of this bike as well. So the fact that they give you the same fork that they do on their highest end version is going to add some extra value to this bike, and of course performance-wise, that fork is going to dampen the road vibration quite a bit as well, again enhancing the comfort you'll find on this bike. So looking at the frame then, the first thing you'll notice is how many mounts we have on this bike. So up top we have the traditional bento box mount, but in the internal section of the frame you'll see we actually have 3 water bottle cage mounts, which is more than usual, and again that's going to lend itself really well to those super long days in the saddle where hydration is super important. If you look at the fork then, we have tons of bag mounts on both sides of the fork, and then on the seat stay of the bike, we do have a mount for fenders as well. So lots of different ways you can dress up this bike. Now one thing this bike doesn't have, which I wish it did have, is internal cable routing. Internal cable routing is a trend that's becoming more and more popular on most bikes, but this bike is still sporting the externally routed cables. Now that could be a pro and a con depending on who you are. Some people would prefer external cables because it does make maintenance a lot easier, but if you do prefer looks over functionality, this is going to be externally routed. Although I will say that the cable is attached to the frame with some actual fasteners, which is great because some bikes tend to use just regular zip ties, which makes it look really cheap, but the fact that they do use actual fasteners on here does make the bike look a little more solid and more put together. Okay, so coming to the top of the bike now, let's look at the stem and handlebar. So the stem and handlebar are both going to be the Kona Road handlebar and Kona Road stem. They are aluminum, but the cool thing with this handlebar is that it's actually 44 millimeters wide, and you could, if you wanted to, equip this with up to a 48 millimeter wide handlebar, which is just bonkers. That is extremely wide, and the fact that this starts at 44 millimeters is pretty interesting because 44 is typically where a lot of bikes will actually max out, but this one starts at that end of the spectrum. The other cool thing with having such a wide handlebar is that this gives you a lot of extra space then to mount a handlebar bag if you wanted to add another bag on this bike for those bike packing adventures. So you're going to have a lot of room to add all kinds of stuff onto this bike. So in addition to those wider handlebars adding that extra bit of stability, there's going to be a lot of ways you could utilize this bike. Also with the handlebars, which I really appreciate, is the fact that the drops are actually flared out. And so that's going to make it easier and safer to switch from the hoods into the drops. And again, that is actually a trend that we're starting to see on most road bikes, so I think Kona is being fairly progressive here. For example, the new Trek Madone has the flared out drops as well, and I think that's going to become more common as time goes on, but the fact that we get it here is pretty great. And because the stack height is so high on this bike, getting into those drops is going to be a lot easier, but more on that in a minute. Now the stem is going to be 80 millimeters long, which is pretty short, so the combination of short stem and wide handlebar is going to make the bike feel comfortable while at the same time making it feel fairly snappy and spunky as well. Of course, not as agile and snappy feeling as a carbon fiber aero race bike, but what you sacrifice in agility with the wide handlebar, you do get back with the shorter stem. So I think it's a pretty good combination. Okay, so now let's look at the seat post and saddle. So the seat post is going to be Kona's thumb seat post. It is aluminum, but it is 31.6 millimeters in diameter. And so what that means is there's ample room to add a dropper post if you'd like to go that route. If you're going to do lots of off-road riding, then adding a dropper post will be an option for you. It'll give you that added bit of flexibility to adjust to your riding environment. Now the seat post is going to have some setback. I tend to prefer seat posts that have 0 millimeter setback, and I think having 0 millimeter setback is the trend that most bike manufacturers are moving toward, because most bike fitters nowadays are pushing their riders a little bit more forward, the idea being that that puts you in a better position to output the power down to the pedals. But that is totally personal preference. Some people do prefer the setback, and if you are someone who prefers setback, you'll have it out of the box. Otherwise, you could just push the saddle up too a little bit, but that's going to be mostly personal preference. The saddle is going to be the WTB Volt saddle. Now, I think it's a perfectly good saddle. If you did want to upgrade this, it'd be a good spot to reduce some weight and maybe add some comfort. Okay, so now let's look at the drivetrain of this bike. So this is going to be mostly SRAM Apex throughout. So it's going to be SRAM Apex for the crankset, SRAM Apex for the derailleurs, and then SRAM Apex for the brifter lever up here at the top right, and then the brake lever at the top left. The only part of this bike that's not going to be SRAM Apex is going to be the cassette and the brake calipers. And that's because SRAM Apex doesn't actually include a cassette or a brake caliper in their group set. So instead, Kona is using a SRAM PG 1130 cassette in the back, and then the Spire Type C brakes. Otherwise, the rest is going to be SRAM Apex. Now for the crank in the front, we are running a 42-tooth chainring, and then the cassette in the back, we are running a 11 to 42 11-speed, which is a massive range. 11 to 42 is such a wide variety, and the fact that the biggest cog there is 42 tooth, this is going to be a great climbing bike both on and off road, and should give you a lot of gears to choose from. Now if you are going to be doing a lot of descending or just super fast aggressive efforts on the flats, you may find that you will spin out at some point, but I think for most general purpose non-competitive conditions, you're going to find you have a perfectly good gear set to work with here. So again, the brakes then are going to be the TRP Spire C brakes. These are mechanical disc brakes, not to be confused with hydraulic disc brakes. Mechanical disc brakes generally don't have the stopping power of hydraulic disc brakes, but because each rotor in the front and back are both 160 millimeters in diameter, that's going to give you a tremendous amount of stopping power, and I personally don't have any complaints with these brakes. They work just fine for me. Again, I think because those rotors are so big, you're really getting a massive amount of friction to slow you down when needed. Otherwise, apart from the brakes and cassette, it is going to be SRAM Apex throughout, like I said, and SRAM Apex for me is an awesome group set. I have absolutely no complaints. I think it's going to be excellent. It is mechanical shifting. It's not going to be electronic shifting, but again, no complaints there. I think SRAM Apex is wonderful. In the bottom bracket, you do have a SRAM GRP 68mm threaded bottom bracket. So I do like how Kona is putting a branded SRAM bottom bracket in this bike and not some no-name off-brand. I think there's no issues there. It works perfectly fine for me. Okay, so now the wheels are going to be the WTB KOM Light Team I-25 TCS wheels. That is a mouthful. Basically, they're aluminum wheels, and they are fairly robust and sturdy. honestly, they're not going to be performance or racing wheels by any means, but for off-road and on-road conditions, I think they're going to be just fine for some general purpose, relaxed use. They are tubeless ready, so you could run these with tubeless tires. Currently, I'm running these with clincher tires, but tubeless is an option if you want to go that route. Okay, so the tires then are going to be the WTB Riddler TCS tires. These are both 45mm front and back, and 45 is actually the widest clearance you can get on this bike, so they are maxed out of the box. Now, they're perfectly fine tires. They are going to be pretty grippy, but also offer a good amount of puncture protection. However, if you do plan on using this bike for a specific purpose, you may want to replace those tires. So, for example, if you will be using this mostly on tarmac and the road, you'll probably want to replace these with a lighter option and an option that's less grippy, that'll roll a little bit smoother with less rolling resistance. Likewise, if you do plan on riding in some wet or muddy conditions or slippery sand, that kind of thing, you may find that you actually want to put some more grippy tires on here, because these tires do tend to slip around a little bit in wet conditions, but otherwise, out of the box for general riding, as I said, I think they do work fine. But in general, I'm a pretty big advocate for upgrading stock tires anyway, just because they're so cheap to upgrade and the performance improvements you get are usually just really, really high. Alright guys, now let's hop in the garage and throw the bike on the scale, and we'll come right back. Alright guys, 2021 Kona Libre aluminum, weighing in at 24.52 pounds, switching to kilograms, 11.12 kilograms, in a size 58. That is real world weight with 2 water bottle cages, 2 pedals, a light mount on the seat post, and a Garmin mount on the front. Now you could definitely shave some weight off that by just changing out those tires and the inner tubes, but out of the factory, we're looking at 24.5 pounds. Alright guys, well let's talk about the ride quality of this bike. So the Kona Libre has a long reach, but it has one of the highest stacks I've seen on any bike ever. And so what that's going to do is make the bike, again, feel super comfortable. This is going to be a very comfortable bike, but the long reach and the wide handlebars are going to really keep the bike feeling stable and confident as well. My first impressions of this bike are that it definitely felt lively enough due to the carbon fiber fork and that short stem, but it didn't feel super agile and nimble like I felt on my aero racing bikes. But what you lose in agility, you definitely get back in comfort. And again, because the stack is so high, you won't need to add a lot of spacers, and that also makes getting into the drops much easier and more accessible because they're just going to be closer to your body. The wide handlebar, of course, as I said, gives that added bit of control when going off-road, and you definitely feel like this is the SUV of bikes. It definitely feels very smooth and confident. Having said that, this bike definitely, in my opinion, favors a more smooth and consistent and predictable riding style. So, of course, if you are going to be doing like racing, crit racing, or just competitive group rides where, you're going to have lots of accelerations and stops and all kinds of turns and lots of technical obstacles, this probably is not going to be the bike for you. This is definitely more suited toward those long endurance rides in the saddle where you want to go maybe a little bit more slow, but keep that comfort as a priority. And of course, riding a bike like this, I think, will help you just maybe enjoy the scenery a bit more than if you were just going for a hardcore effort on a aero racing bike or even a gravel racing bike. This is going to be a bike that you definitely just feel more leisurely with. Now, some people might wonder about the aluminum nature of this bike versus the carbon fiber versions. Well, in my opinion, when I'm out doing off-road riding, I actually tend to prefer aluminum bikes because when I am off-road, in gravel or in the mountain bike world, I know for sure that I'm going to be banging up and scratching up my bike. And I tend to just feel a little bit guilty then when I take a super high-end carbon fiber bike out in those circumstances. I tend to prefer aluminum bikes in those scenarios because I just feel like the bike is less of a worry. And typically with aluminum bikes, they do feel a little bit more like they were produced in a factory when you ride them, whereas the carbon fiber bike might feel feel more like you're riding a bike that was handmade for you specifically. Although I find that mostly to be the case on smooth tarmac, because when you have smooth tarmac, the only thing you're really feeling is the bike underneath you. Whereas when you're out on the off-road environments, the bike you do feel, but you're mostly feeling the bumps and the roots and the gravel and the slips and the slides. And so the integrity of the bike frame for me personally becomes less of a worry, and I would be far more concerned with the tires and inner tubes that I'm running, because I think those are going to influence your ride off-road a lot more than the carbon fiber or aluminum material choice. That's just my opinion. Others may disagree, and there might be perfectly good reasons to disagree. If you do, feel free to let me know in the comments. But that's just been my experience. So I think this bike is perfectly well suited for off-road riding. All right, guys, so the question is, should you buy this bike? Well, I think this is going to be a great bike for somebody who maybe wants to get into drop bar bikes for the first time. If you're used to flat bar bikes and you appreciate the upright comfort, but you maybe want to get something that's going to give you a little bit more options, so place your hands if your hands start to get kind of numb, or just if your body starts to kind of ache after being in one position on a flat bar for the whole time. This is going to be a great option to migrate from the flat bar to the drop bar, because this is going to retain that flat bar comfort, but it's also going to give you several different options, flats, hoods, and drops, to shift up your body position to prevent aching and pains as those long days in the saddle go on. So I think it's going to be a great option for people who want to migrate again from the flat bars to the drop bar bikes. I also think it's going to be a great option if you are somebody who wants to do bike packing or just do long days in the saddle with, again, comfort being the number one priority. However, I would also say that if you are somebody who does do gravel racing or road racing and you have an aero racing bike, sometimes those bikes can definitely be overkill. And this could be a great bike to add to your inventory if you want something that's comfortable, maybe that you can ride with your family or go on some bike trails or just ride a little more casually for those recovery day rides. This is also going to be a good option for that. So I think there's room for this bike in anyone's inventory, whether you're a beginner or an experienced rider, as long as you just keep your expectations within reason. But for gravel riding and comfortable riding, I think the Kona Libre 2021 aluminum is an excellent choice, and I highly recommend it. All right, guys, that's my review of the 2021 Kona Libre aluminum. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, drop a like and hit subscribe. It really does help me and the channel out. Otherwise, I really appreciate the support. And until next time, I'll see you later.